Hello and welcome to the Fossil Huntress podcast. I hope you guys are all doing really well. I wanted to welcome you to 2025 and hope that you guys had a wonderful holiday season and that it was restful and relaxing. Maybe you did some reading or some fossil prep and got to eat some delicious foods and hang out with your favorite people. I know I got some notes from folks who are doing it right, sitting writing papers by the beach in the sun. So good on you, JP. So I hope all of you had a wonderful holiday. Over the holidays, I was reading one of my favorite authors, Simon Winchester. He's written many books that I adore. He's a wonderful writer. And he wrote The Map That Changed the World, which is something we've talked about in a previous episode. And he also wrote a book called Krakatoa, which is about the explosion, the volcanic eruption of the volcano of that same name. And in that book, he reminded me about some of the not lesser players, but less well-known players in the lead up in the discovery and delineation and kind of the aha moment of evolution and Charles Darwin's Origin of Species. So I thought I would share that all with you. So on a bleak December evening, shortly before Christmas, in 1857, in the severely elegant lecture theatre of the Linnaean Society, so Biology Sanctum Sanctorum. And if you don't know the Linnaean Society, they're a learned society dedicated to the study of natural history. And they choose only the most select members. So Charles Darwin, Alfred Russel Wallace, David Attenborough, and honorary members are Her Majesty the Queen Elizabeth II, the Prince of Wales, His Majesty King Carl Gustaf of Sweden, so a lofty list indeed. And I was there in the September time frame when Queen Elizabeth passed away and she was laying in state, and I was there to give a talk. So having recently been in that room and thinking about those worthies, it all came together around this Christmas time. So on that chilly night, Philip Sclater, who was a young man at the time, rose, nervous as can be, to present a paper that, although is much overlooked today, not entirely overlooked, but overlooked for the significance of what it led to, the steady revolution in scientific thinking about the history of our world. He got up in front of those worthies to deliver his paper. He was 28 at the time, and he had won by then an awesome reputation. He'd been to Winchester and Christchurch, Oxford, and he was inordinately clever. He was unusually well-traveled for his day. He'd been to Argentina and Malaysia, India, Australia, most of the states of America. And he was a superb artist. And the basis of his near legendary reputation among his followers today, he was a brilliant ornithologist. So he specialized in the exotic, the colorful, the tropical, and the odd. And he came to know all that there was about South American finch-like birds, tanagers, and their little country neighbors, ovenbirds. And they're called this because they build their nests out of clay, little tiny nests in the shape of ovens. And he would go on to write definitive books on passiforms, that huge class of rather less unusual perching birds. He had a lark named after him. He founded the British Ornithological Club, and he was for many years the secretary of the Zoological Society of London. So he was a young man fast-tracking for greatness and for having his name well known, but it is lesser known today, and hence my sharing him with you. So he had a few black marks against him, not ambitious statements that could have very well have been true. He believed, quite wrongly, that in the Eocene, there was a landmass, the Malayan Peninsula, was connected to Madagascar. And so he made a few mistakes, but he also brought us and became a specialist in new science around that time. So it was growing apace during late Victorian times that we see the beginnings of biogeography or zoogeography. And as more and more specimens of animals and insects, plants and birds were collected, classified and catalogued, so it became more apparent, steadily more apparent, that geography had a major influence on zoology and botany, and that certain living creatures were peculiar to certain parts of the world and not merely to certain climatic zones. So one might find precisely the same climate in, say, Uganda and Queensland, for example, but because Africa and Australia were so far away from each other, their native inhabitants have developed without ever making contact with one another, and so they develop quite differently. And we see the same in the flora and fauna. They're entirely separate, different, and peculiar to each of those two places. And we see this as well play out in the polar populations. So they're an obvious example of this zoogeographical reality. So polar bears and people inhabit the north, and penguins and albatrosses the south. And even though their climatic environment is essentially identical, we see entirely different species. And while that may be entirely apparent today, and you're like, of course it's that way, back in the day, that separation and what makes species develop and be different from one place to another hadn't really been thought about in that way. So the birth and study of these regional differences in populations and plants of the biota was a natural byproduct of the frenetic pace of exploration at the time. So people were venturing out and looking at things and cataloging things and noticing things, bringing back their notes and comparing them. And Dr. Sclater, Philip, was an explorer of the old school. So had, by the middle of the 19th century, a keenly developed interest and expertise in the topic. So the paper he presented that evening to the Linnaeans was on precisely this topic. So it was on the general geographical distribution of the members of the class Aves, with a particular interest in the islands around New Guinea. And Philip offered up what would be to his listeners a remarkable and rather startling discovery. So he had observed what seemed to be a rigid zoogeographical distinction deep within the islands of the East Indies, the kind of dramatic geographical variation that might be seen on the two sides of a vast body of water. So the measure of difference between African birds, for instance, and Brazilian birds, so separated by the whole of the South Atlantic. You might not be expected within the continuum of an archipelago as closely knit as the East Indians. So those islands are East Indies. Those islands are rather close together, but the difference between one island to the next is startling. So astonishingly, this is what he observed and what he brought back to the group. So in months of research that took him right along the 2,000-mile volcanic chain stretching from Sumatra in the Trobriand Islands, Sclater found the occurrence of a huge, unanticipated, and very sudden change. The jungles in the west of the archipelago, for instance, sported birds that were akin to those found in India, while those to the east of a vaguely imagined line, he kind of penciled it in, were alive with avian fauna that were to be found only in Australia. And he hadn't completed enough research to be able to draw a firm demarcation line between the two populations. All he could say for certain was what he had seen. Certain birds, parrots for instance, found in wild abundance in the east, on the eastern Australian end of the archipelago, were quite literally missing from the western Indian side. So there were barely any parrots on Java, but there is every imaginable kind in Sulawesi and Iranian and Timor. Not a single cockatoo is to be found in the West, but two new entire families of cockatoos and lories, which is a kind of parrot with a brush-like tongue, are found in the East. Barely any thrushes are to be found on the islands to the east of Bali. In the western half of the archipelago, there are woodpeckers, barbets, trogons, paradise flycatchers, paradise shrikes, minivets, pheasants, jungle fowl, but none of these, just like the humble thrush, are to be found in the east. The forests of this eastern end of the chain, on the other hand, are populated uniquely with legions of showy and exotic birds that one might just as easily find in Queensland or New South Wales. So the honeysuckers and birds of paradise, cassowaries and emus. And any traveler with half an eye and half an open ear will realize, going through these same regions today, from the colors and the birdsong, that something profound is going on. In making an eastward journey from Sumatra to Irian, though you may not pass out of sight of land, you would have decidedly left one world and entered another one entirely different. And it would be 40 more years before Sclater, working then with his son, would draw a map with the formal delineation, as the pair saw it, that separated the two avian worlds. But his work, which culminated in the reading of this 1857 paper in this December evening, outlined but not quite delineating their meeting place, excited the interest of a much older, bolder, and very much less well-educated Briton who was then living in the Indies, and it was Alfred Russel Wallace, who came swiftly to understand that it was not simply birds who inhabited two quite different worlds. Plants and animals did also. And just like the birds, they all met, collided even, somewhere along the maze of jungles of the myriad of islands in the Dutch East Indies. So Alfred Russel Wallace, who at the time was collecting, studying, and living in the spice-rich islands of Ternate in a grass hut, would take the observations of this young naturalist and, adding a vast amount of information from his own observations and collections, transform them into a theory and a grand cartographic creation that would survive to this very day. It has a name that remains its architect's most familiar memorial, the Wallace Line. So Philip Sclater, learned, patrician, and well-connected, might have thought that he had some vague right to this 2,000 miles of tracery named after him in recognition of his pioneering work out on the region's bird geography, but the honor was eventually to be given to his very much more capable successor, the lowly-born, hugely tall genius from the town of Usk in South Wales, remembered today mainly for having imagined and then drawn this vast and invisible line in the sea. Mainly, but not solely, Alfred Russel Wallace has a trench off Java named for him also, as well as a 13,000 plus peak in the Sierra Nevada, a garden in Wales, an aviary in Bristol, and a bird of paradise. And he's won prizes in biology in both Kansas and Australia. He's had countless lecture theaters and university halls named after him, and craters on both Mars and the moon. And ironically, whoever named a lunar crater in his honor was a man with a mordant wit, or woman with a mordant wit, and an ear for the labored pun. So, because for many years, Wallace has been known, perhaps more widely than anything else, as Darwin's moon, the lesser body that was bound by the fates to dance in constant attendance around the orbit of something greater. Although the Wallace line is yet some importance, and although it was a singular a discovery of many parts and by many people, it's not the most prominent regent for Alfred Russel Wallace's fame. It is his relationship alongside Charles Darwin, as always as his satellite, but never the pioneer of the science of evolution. And that's a bit unfair because Alfred Russel Wallace did some really great work, and in truth, his great work is what spurred Charles, in his bouts of procrastination, to finally publish. So he was born, Alfred Wallace was born in 1823. He was the seventh child of a librarian. It was a threadbare but intellectually respectable family, and he started his own life as a Leicestershire school teacher, but one whose life was marked from the start by passionate fascination. So in his first go-round of looking at something and wanting to study it all day long and everywhere, Coloptera, the insects with hard coverings for their flight wings that are generally and more prosaically known as beetles. And he was interested in some other things, spiritualism, and had a fascination with and dabblings in Freno, mesmerism, and things that were not, that he didn't pursue later to the greater good of all. But he chose his worthier pursuits in his insect-captivated life with another city lad and a sometimes warehouse sweeper named Henry Walter Bates. And once they both shared their love of beetles, insects and beetles, but beetles in particular, they were inseparable, and they hunted and collected and cataloged beetles in every corner of their town and beyond, with Bates publishing his first paper on Coleopterous insects frequenting damp places, the title telling us perhaps more about where they lived than about the beetles themselves. In 1848, 3 years after meeting and having exhausted all their beetle delights in the meadows and damp places of the Midlands, the pair set off. They put all their pennies together and they went to the beetle-rich, insect-rich Amazon rainforest, which would have been an amazing journey in that time and that place, and just the undertaking to get there. For Bates, it was the beginning of a lifelong love affair with what he called the one uniform, lofty, impervious, and humid forest, a love affair that started in the remote Brazilian jungle village of Iga, which is about 1,400 miles upriver. He lived there for 6 years, and he collected and named no fewer than 550 new and distinct species of butterfly. At the time, there was only about 65 known throughout the entire British Isles. He traveled thousands of miles in the deepest and most remote corners of the forest, and over the years became a world authority on insect mimicry, and together with Wallace, ultimately came to be an instigator of the theory of natural selection and an allied supporter of Charles Darwin, once on The Origin of Species, once it had been published in 1859. For Wallace, the journey to Amazonia was just the start of a fascination that soon ranged the entire world. So he's most closely associated with the region he found the richest and most intellectually satisfying, which was indeed, and called then, the Dutch East Indies. Yet his interest did not properly begin until he had been severely tried and tested. On his way home from Brazil, he was on the square rigger Helen, and he was bringing home all his beautiful specimens and catalogs and samples and early notes, and two full stuffed books on the subject. And unfortunately, his boat went down. He was rescued, but he lost all his notes and all his specimens on that foundered ship. But in 1854, Wallace set off again, alone this time, for the East Indies, that chain of islands that he, as a geographer, preferred to call the Malay Archipelago, since the thousands of islands were indeed a classic example of an archipelago, and the islands' lingua franca, the language they spoke, in most cases, to a greater or lesser degree, was based on Malay. And his keen conviction remained for all the 8 years that he spent there that evidence to be found in this particular archipelago would substantiate his two growing beliefs: that geography was highly influential in the development of biology, and that species originated by the natural selection of favored types from within the variations of any population. And he spent the better part of his life seeking to prove those 2 points. And by and large, and in the penumbra of Charles Darwin, he succeeded magnificently. So his collecting zeal was prodigious. He sent back to London, or eventually came back with, a meticulously organized collection of no fewer than 125,660 specimens of plants, animals, insects, and birds of those islands, of which there were 300 plus mammals, 100 reptiles, over 80,000 beetles, not surprisingly, 13,000 other insects, 8,000 birds, 13,000 butterflies, and 7,500 shells. His study of this vast number of living things brought him to both of the epiphanies that he had sought, the answers to his questions, and almost at the same moment. So he suddenly realized evolution's existence and the mechanism, and he recognized the profound difference between the two basic animal and plant populations of his chosen archipelago. And he realized and recognized these two profundities at essentially the same time during what for Wallace were the seminal and his intellectually furious years of 1858 and 1859. So Wallace's sudden understanding of evolution is one of the most romantic tales of modern science, ranking with the achievements of Archimedes and Galileo, and Newton, Fleming, Marie Curie. The vision came to him not in a bathtub or in Pisa or in a Paddington windowsill or under an apple tree, but in a grass hut on stilts in the village of Ternate during a bout of jungle fever. So there are not too few who believe that the Spice Islands and not the Galapagos should one day be called the birthplace of the science of evolution. Well, while he was in his grass hut with his jungle fever, thousands of miles away in Kent, Charles Darwin was working with painstaking tardiness and procrastination on what he called his big book. He knew he was onto something. He had the core of an idea as to how and why new species evolved. He had the facts at hand. He had collected his own beetles, and he'd bred pigeons. He'd observed and measured and cataloged tens of thousands of specimens in his years aboard the HMS Beagle. And he was well aware of Alfred Russel Wallace, not least because in 1855 Wallace, then in Sarawak, wrote a paper entitled On the Law Which Has Regulated the Introduction of New Species, which argued that new species arrive from within variations in a population that is somehow, and he was so often seeing this in the East Indies, geographically isolated from other populations of the same creatures. And the paper presented only an incomplete theory and no mechanism for the introduction of these new species, just that he noticed that on these discrete islands separate from one another, they seem to arise. But that paper was a firestorm for Darwin. it set him once again to pondering and ruminating and procrastinating his way through the actual publication of the big book. And then just after New Year's Day in 1858, Wallace arrived in his eastern islands, the Moluccas, or Molucca as they're once again known today. And during these intervening 3 years of wandering between Sumatra and Irian, he had his full share of excitements. Headhunters had severely scared him on the island of Lombok. His arms and legs had been badly infected by leeches and biting insects, and he'd found a 10-foot snake in the ceiling of his hut in Ambon. And he'd suffered from dysentery, and contracted case after case of malaria. And it was that last case of malaria where he had his last ha-ha on an insect collecting trip to Halmahera that prompted him to go back to Ternate to do a little recouping and recovering. And as he sat and perspired and wrote in fascinating manic styles in sort of fever-induced mania, he suddenly got it. He got the mechanism. And while wondering yet again what it might be that caused the break between one species and the success of a specialized variety that would lead to the creation of a wholly new species, it flashed upon him the idea of the survival of the fittest. And Wallace wrote this account in his book, The Wonderful Century, a long while later. And while there may be some doubts about the legitimacy of his claim to be the first to recognize both the idea and the mechanism of evolution, he dashed off a letter to Downhouse asking Darwin to forward it for possible publication to the geologist Charles Lyell, whom Wallace thought he had better impress. It was instead Darwin who was impressed. The Wallace paper was, Darwin later said, a bolt from the blue. It deeply disturbed him. It was the very idea for which he was looking. It provided the jolt he needed to get on and finish his big book. And when he did, and the book appeared under the now famous Origin of Species, Wallace's crucial reference to the struggle for existence and the survival of the fittest appear as the key to the entire mystery. Charles Lyell and Joseph Hooker persuaded Charles Darwin to share at least some of the glory with Wallace, who was far away and low-born and an upstart, though he may be. And the formal announcement that the puzzle at the root of the science of evolution had now been cracked and was made at the meeting of the Linnaean Society on the 1st of July, 1858. And it was a joint announcement made by the introduction of papers by both Darwin and Wallace, with Darwin admitting somewhat lamely that though he had this very same idea as Wallace some days before, he had never committed it to paper, and procrastination had done for him, but not, it seems, for his reputation. So Darwinism is the accepted word. It's how we refer to the science. It was a term invented by Wallace, and it was, in fact, the title of one of his later books. And with exceptional grace, Alfred Wallace never showed any scintilla of bitterness, and contentedly and generously gave Darwin all the credit in his classic work, the Malay Archipelago, in which he tried to popularize the idea of zoogeographical division, which so divides these islands and species. He dedicated it to Darwin to express my deep admiration for his genius and his work. So Wallace remained loyal, almost servile, the ever-revolving little moon around Darwin's glittering and far greater and grander planet. So that's all I'll share with you for today. So Philip Sclater and Bates and Alfred Wallace were all thinkers and collectors and observers and sharers whose collected work put together helped shape one another's work and eventually lead to Charles Darwin publishing On the Origin of Species. So quite an enjoyable tale. And you can read more about that within Simon Winchester's Krakatoa. He talks about some of the other goings-on in the Dutch East Indies of the time back in the day. A wonderful history, perhaps not a proud history for the Dutch, but a wonderful history. So I will leave it there, and I hope you're all doing very well, and I'll talk to you very soon. Take care.